When you're building a home theater system, you're of course going to have a ton of different gear. Things like a receiver, several amplifiers, power management, and source units like a Blu-ray player. All of this gear needs to connect to each other, and with the heat and noise a bigger system can create, it is best to get this gear all mounted together in an AV rack. Now, how do we pick a rack? What does the build process and mounting of the gear entail, and what are some tips for wiring? What's going on, guys? I'm Mark. Welcome to CarAudioFabrication. I'm currently working on building a home theater here on the channel, and I wanted to take you guys along for the ride on building the AV rack. Let's get started. Now, as I mentioned, the advantage of having an AV rack is we can have all of our gear for our home theater system in a closet or a storage area. So that's where we're at right now, a different unfinished area of the basement that's holding my completed AV rack. So before we get into the build and all of the wiring, how do we pick an AV rack? So there are different styles of AV racks. There's open frame style designs and closed frame. And for my application, I decided to go with a closed frame to better hide the wiring and also to have the ability to keep the gear protected from those little hands that like to push buttons. Fellow moms and dads out there, you guys know what I'm talking about. Now, regardless of the style of rack you choose, you of course also need to determine the size of the rack that you're going to use. This is where I decided to get help from the advisors over at Crutchfield, who are also our sponsor for this video. Crutchfield has a whole team of home theater experts, folks that live and breathe home audio, and they can definitely help you decide exactly what rack size you need, along with determining all the gear for your system. I worked with my advisor Paul to pick out everything that I'm doing on my project, and they can help you out too. To learn more about them and get a special offer, check out the link down in the video description. Based on all the gear that I have, this is the rack that Crutchfield helped me pick out. This is the Sanus 55-inch tall component AV rack. Some cool features on this can be locked. That way we don't have to worry about any kids or any unwanted people messing with our gear if need be. And we can turn that handle and open everything in order to access it all. Of course, you can see that it comes with several different racks. So that way we have space for our 3 different amplifiers, our receiver, and then our different power management solutions and our other sources. Another unique feature, the back side of the panel can also be locked, and then each of these side panels, they can all come off. That way we can access all of our different wiring and do everything a lot more easily, and then button everything up when we're done. On the top here is access for where we can have some of our wiring coming out of the top. Also an access plate down here at the bottom that we can open up. And also at the top, we can cut these little tabs away and remove this grill section. And then there's some mounting holes. They do make a separate cooling solution that I have on order because obviously it's definitely important to keep this rack nice and cool. Just like I mentioned before, to get this underway, I want to remove all of these side panels. That way we're going to have access to everything. This is definitely a feature you want to keep an eye out for. You definitely want to be able to remove all the sides. It makes wiring a ton easier. Now, if you've never seen a rack before up close, the way this works is there's this channel on the side on each of these sides, and it has a bunch of threaded holes in it. And what that allows you to do is take these different shelves and you can adjust them up and down. So there's 2 different things. There's shelves like this, and then there's panels like this that are a separate part. I took one off here. This is a blanking panel. So the idea is, imagine we had an amplifier here and it was about this tall. By having that blanking panel above it, we allow for some airflow up above it, but still have a nice clean appearance. When building a rack, we want to start from the bottom and work our way up. And we don't want this to be top heavy, so we're generally going to put our heaviest components in the bottom 50% of the rack. Now we could just start loading components in and adjusting these shelves as need be, but I think it's going to be easier for me if I just take all of these shelves out and the blanking plates except for the bottom one and start from scratch. It's funny how quickly this rack becomes much more light now that we've got all of those different shelves and blanking panels out of the way. And it is worth noting that obviously I'm building this right in the home entertainment area. It's probably a better idea to build it in the closet or wherever you have the rack going to be permanently located. In my case, just for filming purposes, I'm doing it right here. This particular rack does have casters, so I'll be able to roll it to its final location. Let's take a look at the different gear that we need to build into this rack. And first off, we have a Marantz AV receiver. This 9.2 channel receiver will give us plenty of flexibility for all the different speakers that we're installing. Next, we have 3 different 2-channel amplifiers. 2 of those amplifiers are rated at 200 watts per channel, and the third is 130 watts per channel. We also have a power management system. This not only acts as a surge protector, but also helps keep the voltage to all of our equipment clean and consistent. And finally, a Blu-ray player to be a source for the system. Out of all that gear, the heaviest components by far are the amplifiers, so we're going to get those mounted into the bottom first. Now, this is something else you definitely want to research because sometimes amplifiers will include rack mounting brackets. Using the rack mounting arms will give us better cooling because now the bottom of the amplifier is more exposed than if we were to use that shelf. So I now have each of these brackets mounted. Now, if you had a helper, they could help support the amplifier in there while you attach the screws. But in my case, since I'm working alone, I'm going to take the rack and I'm going to carefully tip it on its backside. With that first amp added, I'm going to add one of the smaller blanking panels on the bottom and then one of the medium-sized blanking panels on the top. These blanking panels really give everything a nice clean look. We're going to continue on with adding the other amplifiers as well. I can now tip the rack into its upward position, and I now have these 3 amplifiers fully mounted in. So now it's time to move on to adding the first shelf, and this shelf is going to be for our receiver. Once the shelf is mounted, we can set the receiver in place, and since this is not mounted directly to the rail, instead we can use these Velcro straps that they give us that hold into the side of each shelf to secure this. Next, I'm going to mount another blanking plate, and then I'm going to mount another shelf. This is a thinner shelf, and this is for our Blu-ray player. As a side note, anytime we're adding a blanking plate or a piece of equipment or a shelf, we want to line up the bottom of it with one of these lines on the rail. For some of this gear to help hold it in, we can use these brackets here. These get pushed into the slot, turned 90 degrees, and then they lock in place. And now the final thing to mount, the power management. If you're wondering, I intentionally left one more DIN of space up here. That will give me a spot for the fan controller for once I mount those cooling fans. For now, I'm just going to fill it with a blank. With all the components mounted in the rack, it's time to turn our attention to, you guessed it, wiring. Now, I don't want to bore you guys with all the details here because a lot of this is pretty obvious. Obviously, you want to connect your RCA signal out of the receiver into the amplifiers. Obviously, you want to connect your speaker wires to the amplifiers and to the receiver for those channels that you're using. What I want to do is I want to get this wired and then focus on what you should be paying attention to when you are doing this wiring. Tip number 1, while you're doing your wiring, use some of these temporary Velcro straps to hold wires in place as you kind of manipulate them into the best path. Then once you're happy with the locations, you can come back and zip tie everything. Tip number 2, run all of our power wires first because these are the largest wires and the hardest to manipulate inside the box here. By doing these first, we'll have the most room for them. And tip number 3, have all the power going down one side and we're going to have all the speaker wires and signal wires on the other. And now we have all my signal wires and my speaker wires coming up this side here and coming out the top, ready to be connected to the rest of the build. So now I can just re-add all of the side panels in the front door here and get this completely installed. Let's open up the access door here. I now have everything completely installed into the completed rack and powered up. The rack is here in an unfinished area of the basement, again, because we wanted to avoid having any of the cooling fan noise in our listening area. We just wanted this out of the way, tucked away. And really, the wiring is nice and tidy because we just have all the output wiring going to all the different speakers on this wall plate here. And the only other connection is this dedicated 20 amp plug right here that powers the whole rack. See this little guy right here? That is an IR repeater because you may have been wondering, how do you use a remote control when this is all in the different room? I go into that in our wiring phase of the project in a separate video. Overall, we've got the 3 amplifiers, the receiver, the Blu-ray player, the power management, and then I didn't show this on video. I mounted this off video because I received it a little bit later. This is the fan management system. So if you look up on top here, I've got 2 large cooling fans, which I definitely recommend for an AV rack because you want to keep your gear nice and cool and it will definitely get really warm. And one of my favorite features you may have already noticed and saw the light kind of in the background here, we can turn on that switch and that turns on some LED lights that I've mounted mounted on the inside of the AV rack. This makes it easier to service the rack, move around any wiring if need be. So I've been documenting the build of this home theater with videos all along the way. If you guys want to see more of this build, check out the playlist here on screen. If you guys are looking to plan your own home theater, definitely check out show sponsor Crutchfield. The Crutchfield advisors are very easy to work with to get all of your questions answered. If you guys want to learn more about them and take advantage of a special offer, check out the link down in the video description. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next video.